Ladies and gentlemen, just please come in, make yourselves as comfortable as you can. I'm in the political science department, and one of the things that you learn in politics is it's better to fill a room than to have a big room that's empty. That's not the philosophy that guided me tonight, but it is. We've found that over the years. But it's great to have all of you. And a special welcome to our guests from the locality and the town. On behalf of the Department of Politics and International Relations, let me welcome you to the Fall Tiffany Memorial Lecture on Foreign Affairs. This is a special day. It's a very important day. 13 years ago, September 11, 2001, a group of terrorists carried out a major attack on our country. The destruction and loss of life left an indelible scar on our nation. Some 3,000 innocent civilians perished, including several persons from our college community. One of our graduates, Todd Beamer, played a heroic role that day, and one of our buildings bears his name. In view of the importance of this day, let us pause in silence to remember the dead and pray for the continued healing for those who have suffered physical loss and emotional challenges from that tragedy. Let us pray. Amen. Before I introduce our speaker, let me say something about the fund that makes this lecture possible. Orrin Tiffany taught in the history department and chaired the department for some 20 years in the 1930s and 1940s. His passion and interest was international affairs, and he taught a course regularly on that subject. Indeed, he was so involved that he got invited to be not a participant, but to be an observer at the San Francisco Conference of the founding of the United Nations in 1945. When Dr. Tiffany passed away, his wife sought to honor his legacy by establishing a fund that would encourage interest in and understanding of global affairs. It has been my pleasure over the past 30 years to help bring people to campus who have helped to do that. And we are deeply honored to have our guest, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, with us this evening. Let me say one other thing also, if I can, because it's a very tight-knit community, and I view tonight's lecture as a symphony. Has a number of movements, including the finale. And the finale is the Q&A. May I request that you stay for the entire symphony to avoid disrupting the entire evening. And now on to a few comments about our distinguished guest. Our speaker this evening is Ryan Crocker, the Dean and Executive Professor of the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. Mr. Crocker also has an appointment as the James Schlesinger Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of Virginia. From 2012 to 2013, he served as the first Kissinger Senior Fellow at Yale University. Ambassador Crocker retired from the Foreign Service in 2009 after a career of over 37 years. but was recalled to active duty by President Obama to serve as U.S. Ambassador to Afghanistan from 2011 to 2012. His previous ambassadorial posts include Iraq from 2007 to 2009, Pakistan from 2004 to 2007, Syria from 1998 until 2001, Kuwait from 1994 to 1997, and Lebanon from 1990 to 1993. Ladies and gentlemen, it's one thing to become ambassador of one country, possibly two. He has been ambassador 6 times over, which makes him one of the most distinguished and extraordinary diplomats of the United States of America in its history. From 2001 to 2003, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs and then served in Baghdad as the first Director of Governance for the Coalition Provisional Authority. Other duty stations in the Foreign Service include Iran, Qatar, and Egypt. In 2009, President Bush conferred on him the rank of Career Ambassador, the highest in the Foreign Service. Later that year, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton announced the establishment of the Ryan Crocker Award for Outstanding Achievement in Expeditionary Diplomacy. In July 2012, he was named an honorary Marine, the 75th civilian so honored in the Corps' 237-year history. A graduate of Wheaton College, Ambassador Crocker is the recipient of a number of honorary degrees. These include doctoral degrees from Whitman College, the National Defense University at Fort McNair in Washington, Seton Hall University, and Gonzaga University. He's also a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the American Academy of Diplomacy. Ambassador Crocker is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Presidential Distinguished Meritorious Service Award, the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award, the Department of Defense Medal for Distinguished Civilian Service, the National Clandestine Service Donovan Award, the Director of CIA's Director Award, the Marshall Medal by the Association of the U.S. Army, etc. Because they go on. In 2009, Mr. Crocker received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the nation's highest civilian award. We are truly honored to have this distinguished statesman on our campus. His lecture tonight is titled Lessons from a Long War, the United States and the Middle East. Please welcome Ambassador Crocker.
Thank you, Dr. Amstutz, for that very kind introduction. I can and have been introduced a number of different ways. I kind of like that way. You know, another way it can be done is pictorially. If you can imagine a picture of every major setback to U.S. interests in the broader Middle East since 1979, I would be in every single one of those pictures. Second row, third from the left, you know, it's, and thank you, Dr. Amstutz, for recalling the significance of this day, the day that changed America, that changed the world, the 11th of September, 2001. Like most of us who can remember, I know exactly where I was that day. I was on a U.S. Air shuttle from Washington, D.C. into LaGuardia for consultations on Iraq with the members of the Security Council. We were making our short final right as the first tower got hit. There's something else significant about today. Those of you who are freshmen represent the last freshman class America will ever have who possess a living memory of that day. Those who come after you next year will only have heard about it. So again, thank you for reminding us of what we've been through and what it means. It changed my life forever. I spent 7 years after 9/11 between Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. And as we gather here today, in the wake of the President's speech last night, as we move into a new phase in a long war, it is precisely to prevent another 9/11 from coming to this soil. So, lessons from a long war. First, let me start by defining some terms. I talk about the broader Middle East. That extends from Morocco in the west on the Atlantic Ocean through North Africa, Egypt, the countries of the Levant, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Israel, the Palestinian territories, the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Qatar, Oman, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. It continues farther east to the non-Arab states of the Middle East, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan. Now, I wonder if, you're all smart kids, I wonder if what or who can tell me what one thing these highly diverse countries have in common. Let me give you a clue. It isn't religion. It isn't language. It isn't culture. Any guesses? It's us. Because every single one of those countries has had an experience with the West. So I'll give you an easier question. What is the significance of 1798, the year 1798, in Middle Eastern history? Boy, you know, there is a test after this. That's why Professor Amstead said nobody should leave during the Q&A, because it's in 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt. Now, most Americans have no idea that Napoleon Bonaparte was ever anywhere near Egypt, but he did have to fill up a little time between major European engagements, so he thought he would spend it there. He wasn't there very long. He gave way to the British. But 1798 marked the beginning of a period in history in the Middle East that I would argue continues to this day. We may break up history in different ways from a Western perspective, the end of the Cold War, the rise of militant Islam. From a Middle Eastern perspective, it was the advent of modern Western armies on Middle Eastern soil. And they came, the French, the British, the Italians, the Russians, the Americans. It was not generally a very happy interaction. It has led, in my view, to the development of a particular political culture in the Middle East. The governments and militaries of that region learned a long time ago that they couldn't face the modern, well-equipped militaries of the West in open battle. So maybe you'll put up a couple of skirmishes for the saving of face, and then you melt away. I would call it the politics of the counterpunch. Long after Western powers think they've won the war, the adversaries they were arrayed against finally go into action. The French found it in Algeria, they found it in Morocco, the Italians found it in Libya, the Russians found it in Afghanistan, we found it in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and on it goes. So here's a lesson from a long war. Those with whom you may be engaged militarily almost certainly have a very different sense of the sweep of history than we do, particularly when the we in question are Americans. Because, again, Americans are all about, let's get her done. Today, tomorrow at the latest, that's how we built this great country. Let's get her done and let's move on. Our adversaries, of course, draw a completely different conclusion. Wait them out. Let them settle in, then start making it painful, and they'll go home. It's worked time and time again. What we require is something I call strategic patience. The ability to understand where you are and with what you're dealing, and to have the patience to stay the course, however long that may be. It requires something else that often is in short supply in the West. It requires a knowledge of those against whom you are engaged. The West, in the period of time I refer to, with the horrific exception of 9/11 and some of the European bombings by Al-Qaeda, plays all its games away. So, if you're going to fight a war, it's always nicer to do it on somebody else's territory. But if you're going to play in somebody else's stadium, you'd better understand the ground rules. You better know just how they perceive history, how they have dealt with foreign interventions in the past, how they look at their own interests, the region, and the world. This, in turn, requires a deep knowledge of history, of culture, and of language. If we Americans tend toward the impatient, we also have a couple of other challenges in dealing with this complex region. We tend to be ahistorical. Again, don't bother me about what happened yesterday. I'm about tomorrow and today. I don't care about what happened in the past. That's not how we built this country. Well, ladies and gentlemen, other peoples do care about the past, and they know the past. They know their own past. We may not know what we've gotten ourselves into. They do. A third lesson is the importance of language. If we are impatient and ahistorical, we are also, by and large, relentlessly monolithic. If they don't understand you in English the first time, say it again slower and louder. You cannot begin to understand complex foreign societies unless you have the advantage of knowing their languages. And we just aren't very good at this. We have I see way too much of them up in Washington, self-styled experts on the Middle East who speak no Middle Eastern language. You know, what would we think of a Chinese diplomat standing here telling you that he was his country's best expert on the United States, but he had to use an interpreter to say it? Well, we do that all the time. So that comes by way of backdrop. A complex region, a complex history, an often bloody history, not just with us, but with the West generally. And I'll make another point on history as well. We're America. We are the antithesis of imperialism. We fought an imperial power for our independence. And we have always seen ourselves in that light with real justification. Our motives are good. We don't go abroad to seize oil or valuable metals. We go for reasons of principle. But, again, understanding history. You can't just understand history as we write it. You have to understand history as the region reads it. And to many in the region, they don't see us as a liberator, as a defender of human rights, of eternal principles of justice. They see us as the next successor in a long line of invading imperialist powers. I can cite you many examples. Nowhere is that more apparent than in Iran. In Iran, I think it was right at the time of the First World War, Winston Churchill, as First Lord of the Admiralty, decided that coal was out of date and the mighty British fleet need to be powered by oil. The oil immediately at hand was in Iran. So the southern part of Iran basically became a British condominium. British governments made and broke prime ministers. In World War II, that British hold tightened. We moved in because we had some vital supply lines to protect, and the Russians came down from the north, setting up a couple of pseudo-republics in Azerbaijan and Kurdistan, and as they did so. The Russians got out. The British, bled white by the war, turned to us and said, oh, by the way, Iran and all the rest of it, over to you. Now, we didn't see ourselves as the successor to the British. The Iranians sure did. And when, less than a decade after the end of the Second World War, this was the time of the fear of international communism, we allowed ourselves to be persuaded that the democratically chosen prime minister of Iran was actually a front man for the Soviets. And we cooperated in a pretty messy but eventually effective effort to oust him from office with the British. That was Mohammad Mossadegh. The year was 1953. There is a direct line, ladies and gentlemen, from 1953 to 1979 and the Islamic Revolution. The Shah was discredited, seen as an American puppet, and in a fiercely nationalistic country, it eventually cost him his throne and has given us some of the problems we inherit today. Again, I cite this just as an example. You will be quizzed on it, of course, and I expect you to have all the dates and names. But these things are important. They live on and on and on. After World War I, the victorious Allied powers came together, and among other things, they drew a new map of the Middle East. You're all familiar, of course, with the Sykes-Picot Accord. that gave Britain control in Jordan and Palestine, that gave the French control in Syria and Lebanon, and kind of sort of split Iraq 1/3, 2/3. It was also the time of the Balfour Declaration. His Majesty's government looks with favor upon the establishment of a Jewish state in the territory of Palestine. It was the time of the Hussein McMahon correspondence between the Sharif of Mecca and the British Governor General in Cairo that basically told the Sharif that at the end of the war, an Arab state would be established there in the Levant. So with Sykes-Picot, Balfour, and the Hussein McMahon correspondence, it became the thrice promised land. Any wonder that there have been problems there since? Now, let me quickly turn to a couple of other points that are relevant to us as we try to assess where we are today. I've told some of you before that after almost 40 years, I did learn some lessons in the Middle East. And I am going to tell you what those lessons are. And lest you begin bolting for the exits, expecting about 2 hours worth of detailed and voluminous exegesis, I can tell you there are only 2 of them. I learn slowly. I figure, one lesson every 20 years is, try and get away with that here. And all I've said up to this is antecedent to it. The first lesson, it's really simple. Be careful what you get into if you're contemplating a military intervention. I've tried to talk about the complexities of this region, its sense of its own history, and particularly its history with the West, their tactics and style of dealing with interventions. So if you're making policy, you have got to decide, is this intervention worth the risk, worth the dangers? Is what I seek to avoid or seek to gain worth the possible costs I may pay? Because guess what? No matter how meticulous the planning is, you can never game it all out, ever. So how much risk are you ready to absorb? How much of the great unknown are you going to embrace before you send our troops across the line of departure? There is not a soul alive who can say today, 2014, well, everything that I predicted happened just as I said it would in Iraq. It all went exactly as I said it would happen. Impossible, because military interventions bring with them not third and fourth order consequences, they bring with them 50th and 60th order consequences. And we are dealing with one of those unforeseen consequences today with the rise of the Islamic State in Syria and in Iraq. Completely unforeseeable. And yet there it is. We could talk about Lebanon and the rise of Hezbollah after the Israeli invasion. The Middle East is blanketed with examples of not being careful what you get into and the law of unintended consequences. The second lesson I learned, just as simple. Be even more careful what you propose to get out of. Once you're in, you're in. You have set in motion a chain of events that may lead in many different directions. But you don't win wars by simply leaving the battlefield. Because there'll be somebody else standing there, and you're no longer around to block that force. It will develop as it is. I would suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, that we did not follow either lesson terribly well in Iraq, whether it's in 2003 or our disengagement in 2011. And guess what? We're back again. I'm going to save some of this for the Q&A because we just had the president's speech. But I think, again, two important lessons to bear in mind when you're deciding what and when to do whatever it is you're contemplating. General Petraeus and I spent half our natural lives in September 2007 testifying before Congress on Iraq. 23 hours. And this was a time when Congress simply wanted to pull the plug on American funding for Iraq operations, and that would have forced a troop withdrawal. Our basic point was the second lesson. Okay, we can have a debate over whether we did the right thing in 2003 or not. You're tired of the war. So are we. We live it every day. But think about what will happen if we pull pitch in 2007. We waited another 3 years and did it anyway, and it wasn't very pretty then as well. Now we are re-engaged. The Iraqis have formed a government, minus a couple of key portfolios, but it was still a very important step. Ladies and gentlemen, that would not have happened without the highest level of U.S. engagement. Secretary Kerry was the most visible figure. He was just there. I can tell you the administration has been working the phones to pressure, urge, beg, cajole the Iraqis into forming a more inclusive government that would allow a nation composed of Sunni Arabs, Sunni Shia, and Kurds to stand together against a common threat to all, and that is the Islamic State. We'll see where it goes. It is a promising step. It is a step that only happened because we re-engaged. Otherwise, that country was in a death spiral. Let's look briefly at Syria, because there's another lesson of history I want to leave you with. The demonstrations started in southern Syria, March 2011. Seems like only yesterday. And our position was, what? Assad must go. Because after all, Mubarak went, Gaddafi went, Ben Ali in Tunisia went, so hey, this is a broad sweep of history. Yeah, except we didn't read history very well. Because in early 1982, Hafez al-Assad, the father of Bashar, surrounded the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, his mortal enemy, in Syria's fourth largest city, Hama. He ringed that city with armor and artillery and reduced the inner city to rubble. He pretty well eliminated the Muslim Brotherhood. He also killed somewhere north of 15,000 innocent Sunni civilians. World didn't much notice, didn't attach much significance, but the Assad regime knew what they'd done. And they knew that one day there might be a day of reckoning when the Sunnis would come after them, and they spent 3 decades perfecting a security state based on overlapping and intersecting apparatuses of intelligence, of security, and of military. They were ready in 2011. The other thing that happened in 1982, after the massacre of so many Sunni civilians, was the planting of deep seeds of radicalism within the Sunni community in a way that we saw in no other Arab state. Pretty easy to understand after you've been through that. But what that meant when the insurrection started in 2011 is that it was just going to be a question of time until the most radical elements in the opposition were the ones who controlled the opposition, and that is just what we've got. We have a situation tonight, ladies and gentlemen, in which an avowed al-Qaeda affiliate, the Nusra Front, Jabhat al-Nusra, is only the second most dangerous force in Syria. The Islamic State is far stronger and far more dangerous. So again, a misreading even of modern history, leading to miscalculations, leading to what we're looking at today. And I'll just end on that point. What are we looking at today? Many of you saw or read the president's speech of last night, in which he said that while we will not put combat forces on the ground, we will take more forceful air action in Iraq. He made it clear that he is now prepared to take such action against the Islamic State inside Syria, that we will increase the number of our military advisors with Iraqi army forces that are reasonably competent and loyal with the Peshmerga. He suggested something I have long urged, that we look at how we might be able to further support Sunni tribes in Iraq who are fighting this common enemy of the Islamic State. And he took a page out of Bush 41's book in saying we will do this with the broadest possible coalition. We got good support during the NATO summit in Wales from our European allies. Secretary Kerry, after a visit to Iraq, is now in Riyadh meeting with the Saudi leadership as well as representatives of the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Jordan, and several others, to see that this is not simply another example of a Western coalition shooting up Middle Eastern territory, but that it is a combined opposition with our Arab allies saying as clearly and loudly as they possibly can, this is not Islamic, and we will not allow it to be a state. That will be crucial. So watch that space, ladies and gentlemen. Post 9/11, post Iraq 2003, we may be just sick to death of this movie. But I'm here to tell you, we're looking at reel 4 of a 27-reel movie. This will be with us for a very, very long time. I simply hope we have the strategic patience, the wisdom, the knowledge of history, the understanding of the importance of allies to see this through, so that what we went through on 9/11, we never go through again, and neither do our allies. I said that was the final point, but it wasn't. I talked about Sykes-Picot, the artificial drawing of borders. The Islamic State has erased the Iraqi-Syrian border. We are looking at other areas of the region, Afghanistan and Pakistan, where the equally artificial Durand line is increasingly under pressure from both sides and increasingly ignored by militants on both sides. Will it hold? We are looking at the disintegration of the state of Libya. Libya was, like other states, an artificial creation. The combining of 3 very disparate provinces who had nothing in common into one country called Libya. We seem to have thought that if we can produce a sustained Allied air campaign against Gaddafi's forces and remove him, that we will again have arrived at a sun-dappled upland where all will be harmony, all will join hands and live in peace. Well, that isn't going to happen. That is not happening now. And we are seeing regional states now being drawn into the Libyan conflict to support different factions. I mean, with the United Arab Emirates and Egypt backing a tribal group in the eastern or the western mountains, and Qatar and Turkey supporting their Islamist enemies on the coast. So among the discussions that are held in Riyadh, we and our Arab allies desperately need to get on the same page as to who we're fighting and why we're doing it. And I would suggest to you that a certain lack of American leadership is why we are in the position we are in. If we are not telling our allies what our strategy is and why it's important to them, and that we need them to be working with us and not against each other, it isn't going to happen. Now I really into the final thing. And that is not about the Middle East.
Thank you very much.
No, I said it, I'm just getting to the final thing.
Oh, okay. I thought you were done.
No, this is important. This is important because
I missed it.
this is about you. I am a graduate of a small liberal arts college, Whitman College in Washington State. I'm deeply honored to be here at Wheaton College, another small liberal arts college. I had the conviction when I graduated. That conviction is with me all these years later. There can be no finer education for whatever future you may choose than a liberal arts education. I hope that many of you will look at the international arena, maybe say to yourselves, Lord, what a mess that Crocker guy made of it, and figure out that perhaps you can do better, because you are getting the tools at this great college through a liberal arts education that will allow you to go forward in public service, in the foreign service. I hope many of you will follow my path, in the intelligence communities, in the non-governmental organization world. I'm on the board of Mercy Corps. These big NGOs play crucial roles in easing suffering in zones of conflict. You are here in large part because you came with a commitment to service. You are getting here the tools that will allow you in uniform or in civilian clothes to serve our great nation in whatever field you choose. I look forward to hearing great things about you. God bless you all. And now I actually am done.
There's time for questions, and please stand and state your question. I'll recognize you, and if we don't, because it's a large room, but let me have hands and raise your question. Okay.
Thank you. You said after point 2 about being careful about what you get out of, you cannot win a war by simply leaving. I wanted to ask, considering the agenda with which we entered Iraq in 2003, what was winning the war supposed to look like, and what does it look like now?
The question was, going back to my points about being careful what you get out of as well as what you get into, how does that apply to the Iraq we entered in 2003? What were our goals? And how does that apply to Iraq today? Is that close enough? Okay. I was part of government in the run-up to the 2003 war. I worked with a couple of associates on a memo that actually WikiLeaks didn't get a hold of. It was called The Perfect Storm. It wasn't meant to be predictive in a direct sense. It was simply meant to lay out for policymakers, if you pull the trigger on this, here are some of the things that maybe you haven't thought about that could really go badly wrong. We talked about the likelihood of extreme sectarian conflict, given the legacy of Saddam's rule. We talked about ethnic tensions. We talked about Iranian intervention. Some of the things we predicted came to pass, others didn't. And again, the point was simply to say, be careful what you get into. Because sitting where I sat, I did not see very much evidence of any serious planning or thinking about what Iraq could, should, would look like after Saddam was gone. You know, we knew that was going to take 10 days to 2 weeks. Then what? Well, there was no then what. There were some who believed, again, you remove the yoke of the dictator and the nature of human beings trends toward the good. They will embrace democracy, they will embrace each other, all will be well. There was another faction who didn't really care much about that. The American role isn't to create new societies. The American role is to get rid of bad guys. And then people can do whatever they want, and we don't care. Either way, it didn't make for much of a be careful what you get into plan. What does that mean for today? Having contemplated the consequences of our withdrawal, both militarily and politically, at the end of 2011, looking at the outbreak and intensification of the civil war, watching Iraqi politicians without our intervention default to zero-sum positions of no compromise, watching a situation develop in which a prime minister so afraid of military coups, of which Iraq has a very rich history, chose his top generals not because of their leadership, not because of their battlefield experience, not because of their general competence, but because of their loyalty, that they would not lead a coup against him. The fact that they could not fight out of a wet paper sack was irrelevant. And that is why the Islamic State rolled right over them. We have now had an opportunity to contemplate the consequences of that. And I do hope that the President's speech is the beginning of a long-term, sustained, and flexible U.S. commitment, both politically and militarily, in Iraq, in Syria, elsewhere as necessary, not boxing ourselves in, maintaining the kind of flexibility that as the battlefield shifts, politically or militarily, we're prepared to shift with it and do whatever it takes. But it means, above all, understanding we can't walk away again without paying the same kinds of consequences that we've already suffered.
Given the lessons we learned in Iraq and how it decomposed, do you think it would be advisable now then for us in our assault on ISIL to cooperate with the Assad regime and its army?
Maybe restate the question in case they didn't hear it.
What is going to do? The question was, given what we have learned through our experience in Iraq, and as we confront ISIL or ISIS or IS, or should we be considering cooperation with the Assad regime against a common enemy? My argument is no, we should not. And here are the reasons for it. The coalition we are trying to build in the region might fall apart under that pressure. The Assad regime is detested by the Saudis. Again, a little bit of history in 2005. Hezbollah, backed by Syria, is believed to have assassinated Lebanese Prime Minister Rafiq al-Hariri, who was like a son to King Abdullah. Very, very personal. But if we are seen as siding with a horrifically brutal minority Shia schism regime, which is what the Alawites are, that's going to be a propaganda field day for the Islamic State, and is likely to turn Sunni Arabs against us, either in the coalition context or in Iraq, where we so desperately need them to make common cause with us and with their compatriots. Now, all of that said, I think if we are able to figure out how to manage a successful military campaign against the Islamic State in Syria, we may change the political dynamic and make possible what has been impossible since this conflict broke out 3.5 years ago. By weakening the Islamic State, it may lead to the strengthening of the secular opposition and more opportunities for us to get in there and start sorting them out, figuring out who can do what, who's allied with whom, who has what capabilities, and who needs what. The other thing it might do is by removing or reducing the radical Sunni threat inside Syria, it may affect a lot of those who stand beside Assad, not because they support him, not because they even like him, but because they are deathly afraid that a mortal enemy will succeed in taking the country, the Islamic State, and they will pay for their lives. If that fear reduces, I could see the possibility of a political dynamic between Sunni moderates on one hand and those in the Assad camp who chose him because he was the least worst choice out of a whole bunch of really bad ones, could develop this into a political process that might lead to an amelioration of the conflict. If we're seen as supporting Assad, we will also be seen as supporting Hezbollah, because they are lined up right with him, and we will be seen as supporting Iran. And all of that will be just, I think, death to any hope of effective cooperation with the Sunnis.
Given a lot of the discussion among scholars, commentators, politicians, and whoever about the splintering nature of ISIS and other groups like it, and given the fact that you talked about the consequences of 50th, 60th order, what do you think will be some of the tactics that will be helpful and actually crucial in going forward in this new strategy that the president has just discussed?
The question had to do with, given some of the analysis that talks about the splintering of ISIS and like-minded groups, what tactics would be the most effective to achieve the goals that the president laid out last night? Is that about right? Yeah. Like al-Qaeda before it, well, they're still around, but certainly not the power they were. ISIS has been remarkably coherent and cohesive. Watching ISIS move through northern Iraq, watching them able to maneuver really in battalion-sized forces, and that is because they took advantage of Sunni disaffection to co-opt a number of former Saddam-era officers who actually know how to fight. They are, who knows what may happen next, but right now they are looking pretty cohesive. What do you do about it? They have had great success in recruiting because nothing succeeds like success. Hey, you're on the winning side, people will flock to join up. Start making it hurt. Making it hurt in a serious way in Iraq and in a serious way in Syria. Because, if you're a young fighter or even a commander who suddenly has to confront the reality that this may end badly, including for me personally, like the day after tomorrow, that affects morale and that affects cohesion. But they've got to feel some pain that they have not yet felt. There is also a political dimension to this. That's when we start talking to as I said, the more moderate elements of the opposition. And And there's something we did in Iraq during the time of the awakening in 2007, 2008. I said with an earlier group that in diplomacy, honesty is the best policy. Well, not always. You know, we got a fair amount of headway against anti-regime, anti-U.S. forces in Iraq by just getting the word out that you do know that Abu Muhammad, 4th Regiment commander, he's really working with the Americans now. Absolute lie, but it did inspire some people to go kill Abu Muhammad and take another commander off the field. I mean, this is war. You do what you need to do to, as the president said, degrade and defeat a mortal enemy of the United States. So that's kind of the approach I take. It depends on the involvement. We've had a lot of involvements. I'll tell you one that worked, a couple that worked right and a couple that worked wrong. Lebanon, 1958. Again, the years of the communist menace. A very clever Lebanese president who had stolen an election managed to persuade Eisenhower and Dulles that his opponents didn't care at all about the election. They were going to take over the country for purposes of joining it to the communist bloc. So in July 1958, we landed the Marines in Beirut. It was a wonderful moment. I mean, Marines came ashore just before dawn, took up their positions, they waited. Lebanese watched them, nothing was happening. So it was a nice summer day, and pretty soon people started coming to the beach, and the ice cream vendors showed up, and you know, it was another summer day in Lebanon. There was a Marine gunnery sergeant who was a Korea War veteran, who was famously quoted as saying, "Well, it's better than Korea, but what the hell is it?" We figured out in a couple of months that we had been kind of snookered on this. And there is something else that goes on in the Middle East. There's a conflation of local, regional, and international events that are almost inseparable. This was an example of all three coming together. When the administration realized there was no communist threat, we pulled the Marines out, no casualties. Fast forward, Lebanon, 1982, Shatila massacre, deployment of the Marines on an ill-defined mission. I was there when 244 of them were killed in one awful October morning. Iraq, 2003. What were we doing? I don't know. But it didn't work very well for us. So now it's 2014. And here I think maybe, just maybe, we're starting to ask some of the right questions. What's at stake for us? What is the real U.S. interest here? Well, in my view, we're dealing with Al-Qaeda version 6.0, including thousands of members who have Western, including U.S. passports, and can get on a plane and be here tomorrow. We have a vital national security interest, and the president has, I think, finally laid that out with reasonable clarity. The second thing is, don't do stuff alone if you don't absolutely have to. So building this international coalition that will have a strong Arab component makes this not all about us, it makes it about all of us confronting a common enemy. So again, careful in, careful out, choose your fights, be sure your interests are engaged to the level that it's worth the risk, because trust me, even if we're not talking about putting in combat troops, we're taking risks. We're taking risks with our special operators, we're taking risks with our allies, we're taking risks with our aviators. But some fights you do need to fight, and I think this is one. I think some of the others, we never should have gotten into them.
I want to follow up on that. Couldn't you argue that it's not a war of necessity, that they aren't in fact a mortal enemy, that their capacity to harm us is insignificant compared to Soviet Russia or the Axis powers of World War II, and that if we went the way of the British and the French and the Russians before us and just washed our hands of it and got out, that while it would probably be worse for the region, could you argue that that's in a narrow strategic interest of the United States?
No. I've already described to you, and I've seen some of this stuff out there. Look what Al-Qaeda did to us with a couple of dozen guys in box cutters. Well, this version of Al-Qaeda, which Al-Qaeda repudiates because they're too violent and extreme, are way, way beyond them in manpower, resources. Money can buy you a lot of mayhem, and they've got it, and access because they've got the passports. So if bin Laden's Al-Qaeda could bring us 9/11, you've got to consider these guys can bring us a whole lot more. And I would really rather take the fight to them where they are than have them bring it to us.
Let's see, I had a hand over here. Yeah. I want to make sure that there's balance here, so.
Do you think that self-determination is a viable way to help empower minority populations in the Middle East, or is there a better alternative?
The question was whether self-determination is a viable way to empower minorities in the Middle East or whether there is a better alternative. Well, we're all for self-determination as a principle, but you better be careful in its application. I've had this argument with my Kurdish friends for years, and it goes something like this. What were the very worst of times for Kurds in the modern era? Sometimes there's a little debate about that, but normally they say it's, the Anfal campaign, when Saddam's forces used poison gas in Halabja, conventional forces in the West just murdered thousands and thousands of innocent Kurds. And then I ask, what was the best of times? There's no debate then. They said, now, baby, now, right now, this is it. This is as good as we've ever had it. And my answer to that then was, you're right. Don't overplay your hand. Do not push for formal independence and get the backlash that's going to come at you from Iraq, from Turkey, and from Iran, because you're going to be right back in the worst of days. So principles, we're a nation of principles. But if you're out there in the smoke and the dust of the real world, you've got to figure out what the application of a principle can actually mean on the ground for our interests and the interests of our friends. So applied self-determination, again, after taking the same kind of careful examination I was talking about in a different context, be careful what you get into. I think that applies in this case as well.
We'll take two more questions, one over here.
I'm following up on an earlier question. Where are the resources coming from for ISI? I mean, I'm astounded that with their atrocious reputation, they could be summoning any financial support from any decent source.
The question was, where are the resources for ISIL coming from that, given their reputation, that hard to believe they would be getting resources from any decent source. You're right. These resources are not coming from any decent source. They come, as I understand it, from a variety of avenues. First, when they rolled through northern Iraq, they picked up a whole lot of cash and a whole lot of hardware. We know about the hardware, but we also know that they looted the banks in Mosul. Lots of money there. Again, nothing succeeds like success, and as they appear to be on a roll, I think there have been all too many private individuals of means who have found ways, probably by couriers, because the Arab states are tracking banking transactions pretty closely. But it's easy to load up those suitcases and get it out. And then there is organized crime and extortion. If you're going to live in ISIS territory, not only do you have to be their kind of Muslim, you're probably going to have to pay for the privilege. So very, very well financed.
I had a question over here, or, oh, okay. Yeah, okay. Yeah, Michael.
What would be a viable and realistic end to the conflict between Israel and Palestine?
In 30 seconds.
This is the last question.
You know, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is tragedy within tragedy compounded by tragedy. Successive American administrations and others have put a tremendous amount of work into this. I mean, it was George W. Bush back in 2004, 10 years ago, who laid it out in a speech, a two-state solution. Two independent states living side by side in peace with the necessary assurances and guarantees that neither would be a threat to the other. That has never seemed to me to be an impossible goal. But for lots of reasons, and you can hand out the blame liberally on both or more sides, we are farther away from that solution than we have ever been. Here's another example of a principle that sometimes doesn't quite play out for you. Democracy. We're for it, right? I mean, the Gazans had a reasonably fair, reasonably free democratic election, and guess who got elected? Hamas. And that certainly drove the prospect of a two-state solution, that much farther away. I would just hope that after the awful mayhem we witnessed recently in Gaza, the fact that some of Hamas's traditional allies did not come to their support. Hezbollah, who supported them in the past, said, hey guys, you're on your own. We got our hands full. That a carefully orchestrated campaign against ISIS that can change political dynamics inside Syria as well as in Iraq can then create a change in a regional dynamic that may bring us another step closer to what I think is the only viable solution, which is that two-state solution. But people are losing hope. They're losing hope on both sides. And, while we are fighting the hot war against ISIS and those related to it, we cannot lose track of this conflict. But frankly, right now, I see very few levers that we can pull on either side that are going to bring an outcome that has been clear for a decade to fruition.
Ambassador Crocker, thank you very much.
Thank you.